I'm very happy to be joined by Mark Ellis, who's going to tell us a little bit about himself and his books to get us started.
Thank you very much for having me, Kaz. It's a great honor and a pleasure.
Do you want to tell us a little bit about your book series?
I will certainly. So I write a series about a wartime detective in London, a World War II detective called DCI Frank Merlin. I've written 5 books, the 5th of which, Dead in the Water, has just come out this week. It was always my aim to have a series when I wrote the first book, and I had the aim of taking one detective gradually through the war from beginning to end. And that's how it's turning out. Each book has about a 6 to 9 month gap. And my first book was set in January 1940. My second book, September 1940. My third in June 1941. My fourth in December 1941. And this most recent one is set in August 1942. And the next one will be set in April or May. I haven't quite worked out which month. Spring 1943. I took up writing in my 50s. I had always wanted to write books, but I was distracted by a career. I was a barrister for a while. Then I went into the City of London. Then I worked for other people. And eventually I started my own computer services company with an Indian partner of mine. And in due course, we built that up and sold it. And when we sold it, I had to make a decision of whether I wanted to carry on in business or do something else. And I decided I'd always wanted to write and I better give it a go. And that's what I did.
I'm sure lots of people are very happy that you did. Let's start off easy with why you chose to set them in World War II.
Okay, so we were in the early 2000s, and I'm thinking what to do, and I had a number of different ideas. I did definitely want to write crime fiction because I wanted to write, but I did also want to write commercial fiction that might actually one day make some money. So I picked crime fiction, and then I decided I'd also like to do historical crime fiction, and I had a few ideas, some ideas going back to the 18th century and so on, but eventually I focused and honed in on the World War II. There were reasons for that, mostly personal. My father fought in the Navy in the war, and he was based for a period in West Africa, and he contracted a bad respiratory disease, which was a wasting sort of disease. And so when I was born in 1953, he was a very ill man, and he continued to be an ill man, and most of my memories of him, sadly, are of visiting him in hospital. He eventually died when I was 7 in 1960, but the fact that he died because of the war loomed large in my childhood. Over and above that, then my mother lived through the war, and she worked as a secretary in what was then the Great Western Railway, which has now come back, which still exists. And she worked in what they used to call the goods shed in Llanelli in South Wales. And people who worked in the railway then, and I'm pretty sure still now, get perks like free tickets and or reduced price tickets, and also reduced price hotels if they go somewhere. So she was able to go for a weekend to London with her friends for pretty much nothing and stay in, I think it was the Strand Palace Hotel. And she was a nice looking woman, and her friends were nice looking women, and they went up to London to enjoy the nightlife. And I believe they had various adventures, which of course I do not know the details of, but American officers featured somewhere along the way. Anyway, so she was going up to London in 1944, and I would talk to her about it. And I said, well, weren't there the bombs going on? It wasn't the Blitz, obviously, but it was the period of the Doodlebugs, the V-bombs. And they killed lots of people. And I said, well, didn't you worry about the bombs when you go up? She said, well, no, we just wanted to have fun, and you got to live life. And she'd seen a lot of bombing in South Wales, because from her house in Llanelli on a hill, she could see Swansea was very heavily bombed, Swansea, which is where I ended up coming from. And she had stories about that too. So if you put that together with my father's experience, I was just intrigued by World War II. and I decided to set my series in that period.
Good answer. What can you tell us without spoiling it about the premise of Dead in the Water?
Well, I can say there are various strands of history that are rolled into it. Generally speaking, when I start on my next book, which I'm doing now, I do my research. I don't really have any idea as to plot. As each book goes by, I just think that a new plot will come up during my research. It always has. So if I talk about Dead in the Water, when I was doing my research, there were a number of things I came across. First of all, 1942 is when the American military arrived after Pearl Harbor, and they joined us in the war. And I read quite a bit about the difficulties that came, particularly the racial difficulties, because the white soldiers, generally speaking, looked very much down on the black soldiers and treated them badly. If a white soldier saw a black soldier in a pub, they would not like that. They would like only to have whites-only pubs. And indeed, during the war, some British areas eventually went that way and had pubs for white people and pubs for black soldiers. Also, if they saw a black soldier dancing with a white girl in a dance hall, that raised all sorts of southern state sort of annoyances and violence. And so that was very interesting. So I decided I would put that as part of one of the strands in the book. I was also reading about the looting of Jewish art the looting of art from Jewish families in Europe before the war by the Nazis. And I thought that would be an interesting strand to bring in, particularly because my third strand came from reading a biography about a real man called Calouste Gulbenkian, who I don't think many people have heard of these days, but he was actually the richest man in the world in 1942. He was an Armenian who'd been involved in introducing all the major oil companies to the Middle East in the early part of the 20th century. And he was known as Mr. 5% because that was the percent he got forever and a day from having introduced those people into Iraq and Persia and wherever. And he was a very rich man living in Lisbon in the war, and he had built up a huge art collection. So if I merge that together with the idea of the Jewish art being looted, it just occurred to me it might be interesting if maybe some of that Jewish art ended up in London. Mr. Gulbenkian wanted to buy it, and in the background there would be these issues of the American soldiers. Somehow or other, I would pull all that together into a plot, or actually it's really several plots, but coming down to a hopefully good resolution, and that's what I did.
That is very definitely what you did. I would say,
and I'm very pleased with I'm very pleased with this particular book. I mean, you have different views with each book. Did I pull it off this time? I think I did pull it off this time. I'm not saying I didn't pull off the other ones, but I feel particularly attached to the story in this one.
I feel like this is my first book of yours I've read. And obviously I've started at book 6. So I think I got confused.
Five. 6 is next.
5. Yeah. Book 6 is next. Yeah, sorry. Yeah. So I started at book 5, which I think occasionally I mixed up some of the people.
Yeah.
But they've obviously had quite a character arc over the series. Can you tell me maybe a little bit more about your main character?
Sure. And it's interesting you mentioned, if I do get one thing, I get occasionally people saying there are a lot of characters in my books. And I've had this sort of long debate with publishers about whether I should do a cast of characters at the front of the book or not. I tend personally not to like it because I think to myself, if I see all those names, I know that one or other of them is a murderer. Whereas if you don't see the names, everything is a surprise. That's my take on it. But obviously, the principal character is Detective Chief Inspector Frank Merlin. So he's got quite an exotic background. He's actually half Spanish, half English. His father, Javier Merino, was a seaman from Corunna in northern Spain, who ended up in the port of London before the First World War, fell in love with a local Cockney girl and got married. And they took on the family chandlery in the East End, in the port of London. and they had 3 children, of whom Francisco Marino was the first and the oldest. In due course, Javier Marino got fed up with his name being mispronounced and changed his name to Harry Merlin, and all of his children similarly. So Francisco Marino became Frank Merlin. Obviously, he's not really Spanish. He's really a Cockney Londoner, but his Spanish background gives him occasion, when angry, to make Spanish oaths every so often. And he has a family some of whom are in Spain, who actually feature partially in this story. I was criticized the other day by saying too much about his personal development, so that it was a bit of a spoiler as to where he got now, having been at the beginning. In the beginning, and I'll say no more about where he goes to personally, but he's a widower in the first book. His wife has just died of leukemia, and so he's a rather sad person, personally. But let me just say he gets a bit happier. So he has a gang. He has his boss is the assistant commissioner, Gatehouse, who, in the style of many of the books and TV programs you think of, is a bit grumpy. But they have an okay relationship. But occasionally the AC gets on Merlin's nerves. But they are sort of a continuing theme through the book. And it's always a case of a good way to bring the case up to date and summarize things by putting the AC together with Merlin, and I do that. There are also a group of junior officers. There's a loyal sergeant. There is a woman officer, which would have been unusual in the war, but a woman detective officer. And there is a Cockney youngster who was a champion runner. And along the way, there are various personal engagements, which I won't go into in any detail. But that's the core group. And as I say, yes, that's the core group in all 5 books.
Good description. So we've got quite a few hellos. A few people have said,
hello, everyone.
It sounds interesting. Sam has said there's a wealth of books and shows featuring the World Wars, which is a wonderful tribute to the many people who did and do protect us. Why do you think we find it so fascinating?
Well, first of all, someone like me has a personal connection with it, so that's why one of the reasons I find it fascinating. But obviously, people who are of a younger generation, every so often things are brought home. Like was it last year or the year before? I've lost track with the lockdowns and everything. But we had the anniversary. What was it? 1945 to 1920. What was that? That's the 65th. Am I right? 55 plus 20, the 75th anniversary of VE Day. So I think that brings home to people what's happened, and I think this is not perhaps answering the question directly, but I did see there was a Daily Mail survey a few years ago about which are the TV programs we miss most, and by a long chalk, Foyle's War won it. And that Foyle's War was really, 10 years ago, 15, 20 years ago? I think continuously throughout the history since the end of the war. Maybe it ebbs and flows a little bit, but people like knowing about what was such a dramatic period, very dramatic period in our history. Of course, one of the weird things now, with everything that's going on in Ukraine, is I'm writing books about World War II London, thinking, up until a few months ago, well, we'll never see this sort of thing again in continental Europe or in Europe. And here we are again, we are seeing it in the Ukraine, which is quite, what can one say? Very shocking. But I meet lots of people who are just fascinated by World War II. And obviously I am fascinated, but I get even more fascinated because I continue to discover interesting new information, which, most of which I pile into my books. Like most people aren't aware that there was a crime boom in the war. When I started out, most people had a view that somehow or other the criminals must have had a stiff upper lip and limited their activities in to join in with all the rest of everyone having a stiff upper lip and getting through the war. Well, far from it. The criminal community realized that they were on a big thing. They had the blackout, you had rationing, had the black market, We had the police being stretched because some officers went off to fight in the war. There was lots of opportunity. So crime in England and Wales rose by 60% between 1939 and 1945, which obviously then creates huge scope for me in terms of what you can write about, because there was a whole variety of things that people got up to. There was a criminal called Mad Frankie Fraser. I don't know if people remember him. He was a very nasty criminal who worked for, I think, the Richardsons, which was the other gang opposite the Krays in post-war London. But he was in the war, and in his later days, he became a bit of a TV celebrity, and he had a biography, Ghosted, and he was appearing on, I think, Russell Harty or Parkinson or something like that. And he went on about, that's bleep, 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 Hitler. Why did he bleep, bleep, bleep give in so easily? We were having such a lovely time in the war as criminals. So
I'm going to
answer the question.
It does. Well, it kind of does. I'm going to loop back to the criminal thing because I learned that from your book about the war. I think you're also right about the sort of personal connection. We're sort of only getting now to a time where people don't have some kind of personal connection, don't they?
Yeah.
To the war. So, like, my granddad was in the Navy in the war and worked on minesweepers and things.
Yeah.
But
very dangerous work.
Yeah. Now we're starting to get to sort of the era of people who don't have that connection, and it'll be interesting to see how that changes.
Yeah, when I grew up, after my father died, I was living with my mother and my grandparents. And my grandfather had been all through the First World War in the trenches, 4 years, in Ypres and the Somme. He just about survived. But as a child, one isn't interested. I didn't ask him questions about it. And not that as generally speaking, most people who had that experience don't want to talk about it. But I wish now I'd really talked to him about that, because that is fascinating too. But unfortunately, he died when I was about 17. I'd never had the discussion at all. But so one day maybe I'll write a World War I book. I don't know. But I think the whole thing, it was such a dramatic thing for this country, both of those periods, and everyone has family stories about it, and I think that's what drives a lot of the interest.
So going back to the crime wave, there's a lot of interesting things I learned from your book, which is one of the reasons I gave it a good review. Educational. I read mine on the bus quite often, and I leave it at work. And one of my students was really interested in your book and the title because he thought it was about the Blackout Ripper. Is that someone you've heard of?
The Blackout Ripper, yes. In fact, I've written about it in articles. The Blackout Ripper was an airman. I'm now going to let myself down by not remembering his name. His name was Jeffrey something, I think. And yes, he in downtown London, which was in the blackout in I think February or March 1941. At least 4 women were mutilated and killed, and he was eventually, and they think that he may have done many, many more. And he was arrested, and in those days it all happened in pretty short order, and he was arrested, convicted, and hung. And indeed, in one of the Merlin stories, I talk about him. Well, in this one, he ends up going to a hanging scene. But in a previous book, he also goes to a hanging scene, which is very much the person being hung is very much meant to be the Blackout Ripper. But the blackout obviously, made it easy for robbers, thieves, and there was a huge crime boom in that sort of thing. There was murder. There were people who tried to take advantage of the Blitz in their murders by dumping bodies in ruins and hoping they wouldn't be picked up. And, picked up as crime victims. They'd just be written off as bomb victims. But again, there's another guy called Harry Dobson who did that. He strangled his wife, put her in the bombed out ruins of a church, and kept his fingers crossed. But unfortunately, the pathologist was on his game and noticed that worked out that the neck had been broken, and he went to the hangman too. But in terms of, if I talk about general crime, I mean, there was a lot of gang crime. There were a number of gangs. The principal one was run by a guy called Billy Hill, and he was a king of the black market. They did lots of smash and grabs of jewelry stores in London. Generally speaking, he tried to avoid violence if he could, but inevitably sometimes violence occurred, and he actually features as a character in this book. The one area of crime he didn't get involved in particularly was vice, which again was a huge booming area, because if you can imagine all these soldiers coming into the country, then going on leave, all over the country, but I'm focused on London. Hordes of people would be coming into London, soldiers looking for a good night's fun. So there were prostitutes, brothels, clubs. The vice game was run mostly by Maltese criminals. In particular, there was a gang called the Messina gang who ran all of those things, and they had hundreds of prostitutes, which were called. The name was the Piccadilly Commandos. And so yes, and that, I think I have an element of that in my previous book. So all of these things are just wonderful, terrible things, but wonderful things for a crime writer to write about. And there were all again, there was a lot of there were scams that people had. There was a vast amount of building work given out because there were air raid shelters and so on, and there would be corruption where people would, in the council, would be given a bung, and people would put substandard materials into the shelters. There was a case in Hammersmith where 40 or 50 people were killed, wounded, when an air raid collapsed in air shelter collapsed in a raid, and it was eventually discovered it was not fit for purpose, and people in Hammersmith Council and the builders went to jail.
Yeah, I think I read in your book as well something about that. One of the other things I found particularly interesting and didn't know about was that the Americans and people like that had sort of agreements with the government that they would prosecute soldiers.
So that was in August 1942, which is exactly the time of this book, Dead in the Water. There was an act of Parliament which gave the American authorities complete jurisdiction over any crimes involving, even whether as suspects or proven criminals, American soldiers or American citizens. And so that is introduced at the beginning, pretty much at the beginning of my book. And one of the stories is that Merlin starts investigating a crime where there's an American suspect. He takes, and he happens to be a black suspect, and the case is taken off his hands. And Merlin believes, I don't want to say too much about the story, but Merlin believes he's.
Don't give away anymore.
No. So, yes. So that features very heavily in the book. And I particularly like having real characters in the books playing parts. So in this particular instance, the head of the US military in the UK was General Eisenhower. So he gets involved. And I have a scene with Stalin, have a scene with Goering, and this is not all, well, let's put it in here. It all does link into the story in a sort of integral way, and I enjoy doing that.
It does, and I think it worked really well, because you couldn't write that book and not have some of the real people in.
Yeah, but
you did work them in a way that felt like a natural part of the story. Yeah. It did feel like you were meeting them.
You have to try. Well, I try to make it clear as much as I can during the fictional story that's rolling on what is happening in the war as the background, just the sort of procedure. You need not to do too much. You don't want to bore people and with acres of information, which might be interesting if you're reading a history book, but it's not in a fiction book. So you have to be very, very careful, and I try to be careful not to overdo it. But I do like people to know where we stand. People are getting in the bus or the underground and discussing. At this particular stage, the threat of invasion in this book had passed because Hitler decided to invade Russia. But in terms of the war in general, we weren't making much progress. The main arena where we were then fighting was North Africa, and we were. It was a bit of a stalemate, and there wasn't much good news. So that was an atmosphere of. In fact, I think Churchill was probably at his weakest in that particular point. There were even people who wanted to get rid of him as prime minister. So so I like to have people to have an idea. I mean, the first book, Prince's Gate, which is now The Embassy Murders, because some of my titles have changed, if people don't know. But that's in January 1940, which is the period of what they used to call the phony war. So there's not actually much happening in the war. The various restrictions are being introduced, but the Blitz is 6 or 7 months, or 8 or 9 months away. But at that particular time, there was a lot of people still wanted to do a deal with Hitler. Appease us. They thought we would never win. Amongst those was Joseph Kennedy, the leader or the head of the famous Kennedy family, who happened to be the American ambassador, and he was completely defeatist and undermining the government and everyone else. And so I brought that in, and there are murders that occur in the embassy, and but that's the sort of historical background to it.
The other thing I found really interesting is there's a discussion of forensics.
Yeah.
Quite a few times in the book, and they look at things like the bullets and stuff like that. And I don't know, personally, the level of forensics it was.
Well, I mean, it was more advanced than people would think in terms of bullet casings, shell casings. Obviously, there was no DNA or anything like that, but guns, burn marks, medical things like strangulation marks and so on. All of those things, they knew of, and poisons. They were obviously. It's only 15 or 16 years before the war that there'd been Dr. Crippen and so on, and so they were knowledgeable about a range of things that people find surprising. But by the same token, I find it relaxing that I don't have to go into DNA and things like that. It's easier to put your plots out and to get murderers and so on, rather than and obviously cameras and walls everywhere. We don't have that, and so it makes it easy. My job easier, I have to say.
Well, we didn't even know the structure of DNA until 1952, so
no,
you're okay.
Yeah,
in the era that you're in. Moving away from that, tell us about your involvement with Gwil Crime Fest, because that's something.
Oh yes, okay, yes. So Gwil Crime Fest is a festival of Welsh crime authors, and the situation is that most parts of Britain have had for quite a while a crime festival. There's Bloody Scotland, and there's the Harrogate Festival in the north of England. Everywhere has had one except Wales. There are ones in Ireland too. So I'm a member of something called Crime Cymru, which is a collective of Welsh crime writers. Well, that sounds very fancy, collective. I mean, basically, it's a bunch of Welsh writers who said, "Hey, shouldn't we try and get a festival together, or do stuff to make Welsh crime better known?" And we have some very good writers who are in it. Perhaps the most prominent at the moment is Alice Hawkins, who's one of the nominees for the one of the CWA daggers this year, and there's also Chris Lloyd, who won the History Writers Association Gold Crown last year. And there's it's invidious if I start mentioning too many people, because I could mention them all. I mean, there are lots of very good writers there. In any event, we decided that we would like to have a festival, and this was before the COVID, and we had plans to have an in-person festival in Aberystwyth, but then COVID came along, and we've had two festivals so far. We had a digital one the first time around with some very good people like Lee Child, and a whole bunch of really big names, along with our own Welsh writers. We were going to have one in person this year in April, but as people may know, Wales has been particularly strict as regards restrictions and so on. And when we had to make a decision, which was in December, it just looked too dodgy to commit to a physical one. So we had another digital one with lots of other good people. And if you want to look at, if anyone here wants to see it, it's all still up on YouTube, and all the various panels are there. I was on one with Mark Billingham, and Philip Gwyn Jones, which we really enjoyed. Anne Cleves is on another one. There are a lot of. I know, if I list them all, I'll miss people out and they'll get upset. So there are a lot of good people. If you go to Gwyl Crime Cymru Festival on YouTube, you can then find a number of videos there. So the plan is now, of course, hopefully there's no disastrous virus. I was reading about some monkey virus today. Have you read about that? I'm not quite sure what that is. Monkey paw, is it? Something. Hopefully that's not going to stop us having. So the aim is we'll have a real in-person festival next year in Aberystwyth in April. Of course, in West Wales in April, you can guarantee the sun is going to be shining for 24 hours a day. So bring your umbrellas.
Donna Morfitt attended it. She's commented on here that it was.
Oh yes, yeah. Hello, Donna. Yes, I recognise Donna's name.
It does look wonderful, and it's great to know. When we started our festivals up in our group, we wanted a Welsh crime panel, and we really struggled to find Welsh authors. So it's so good that there is like that representation starting.
Yeah, I think we have something like 30, maybe 30 or 40 members now, I think, and we it's quite a big group now, and we have daily conversations. And I was at the Bristol Crime Fest at the weekend, and there were a few of us there. We had a drink or two, and we were on the various panels. And so I don't want to be too nationalistic about it. I'm happy to go to a crime festival anywhere, but at least I'm glad that Wales has one of its own now.
Are you going to the Harrogate Crime Festival?
No, I'm not. There was some discussion about it, but to be honest, I'm away on holiday, so I know I should probably give up holiday to go to the Harrogate Crime Festival, but not this year. Maybe next year. There are a few other potential ones coming along. Last year I was on the Essex Book Festival. I mean, there's so many festivals these days. You could spend your life being at festivals and never writing any books. But I've sorry.
I just booked tickets for a Bradford Literature Festival.
Oh, really? Okay. I think that's something that the Midas are involved with. My PR company, I think they're involved with that.
It's really good. It looks like a really good program.
Yeah, great.
I haven't delved too far out in what's happening on the other days to the ones I'm going on because I've already spent too much money.
Yes, they're not cheap. Some of these places, some of these events, are they?
So the ones at Bradford are really reasonably priced. Actually, they're about £7 for a panel, and they do discounted tickets as well, which is quite.
The one that I just went to at Bristol, they were charging you. You can only pay for a ticket where you go, for the whole thing. I think, or for each day, or something like that. So if you go to the whole thing, it's like £200.
Yeah, some of them are quite pricey, but it's worth it to go and meet all your incredible authors, isn't it? I think that's what we say. Simon said she finds it fascinating how far the medical profession advances in awful circumstances. The research for that must be harrowing. I mean, World War II is renowned for, especially in the German side, some particularly horrific.
Yes, of course there are some terrible things that go on during the period of my stories, and I'm not one of those authors who likes to dwell too much on the specific violence. I mean, some do, some don't. But yes, I've had to read quite a lot of horrible things in the context of both the crime world in London, what the Nazis are getting up to, Russia. Yes, I have a scene in the current book. I'm not giving away too much, where one of the characters ends up going to a dinner which hosted by Stalin in Moscow. If you may remember, it's an American character, is a friend of my detective, and Stalin comes up and makes him drink a couple of toasts, and then he goes away, and the man next to him says, "What's it like to be so up close to a man who's killed 3 million people?" So yeah, there were evil ogres all over the place in World War II London, World War II Moscow, World War II Berlin, whatever.
That scene is quite amazing because you have Stalin and Churchill at dinner together, don't you? And people debating like who's going to outdrink each other. And
yeah, I'm not going to say who wins.
Donna's got a really good question. She said, you said it was easier to write without worrying about DNA, CCTV, etc., but does it make it harder to catch killers without those things?
Yes, well, of course it does. Yes, so you have to be more. On the one hand, I don't have to worry about the facts saying, well, this person was killed, and then they would know that, therefore it would be easier. I don't have. It does make the crimes harder and more difficult to solve, which I hope makes it more interesting and entertaining. There has to be good old-fashioned detective work, and there's a lot of good old-fashioned detective work in the Frank Merlin stories.
There's some really ingenious things in your books as well, like them working things out from like a picture or a card in a wallet or a pin left at the scene or things like that, isn't there? Lots of little kind of clues that they have on.
Yeah. I mean, those things, they come to me as I go along. I mean, I don't think I've mentioned my sort of writing process, but I don't plan out a plot in advance. As I said earlier, I get my ideas for plots when I'm doing my research, and I then sit down and start writing with those ideas in my head. And obviously I have my principal characters now, so I know where they are and I can kick them off in the story. But I just sit down and I write, and as I go along, the story develops. What I do is I write one first draft. I don't spend any time editing it. I just splurge it all out. I think the rather pompous explanation I gave to one questioner on a panel at some festival was, if you're a sculptor, you have a piece of rock with which to work, a piece of marble, and you chip away at it. If you're a writer, you need to create the piece of rock or the piece of marble, which is your first draft. And so that's what I do. I splurge it out somehow or other, whether it be pins or small items which are indicative. They come to me as I go along, and I splurge out my first draft, which is on this most recent book was 200,000 words. And then I sit down and I start chipping away as a sculptor. And I usually do anything 15 to 20 full edits. And that takes sort of writing the first draft is probably the hardest bit. The editing I quite enjoy. You're just chipping away, improving. And sometimes there are things occur to you which you need to change. But generally speaking, I find I don't need to make any, hitherto, I've never had to make any major structural changes. And when it goes to the publishers have never suggested structural changes, which is quite a common thing when publishers look at people's books. So I don't quite know how it happens, but it does happen. And at the end of the day, I got a book.
This is a thing that I find, and I've got a theory, being a scientist, obviously, about this, that the people I find who often write without a plot, just as they go, are the people who write the most complex books.
Possibly, I do my books. I will not deny that my books are quite complicated, and some people, write a review and say, I quite like the story, but it's a bit too complicated. But that's the way I like writing them. I like having different strands of plots and so on, but which somehow or other link together at the end in a rather hopefully a satisfying way. But I have been on some panels at festivals with where the discussion subject has been, are you a seat of the pants person or are you a planner? And a lot of people are planners, and they I was on one the other day, and the person said he wrote a 40-page treatise of what would happen in the book, everything which would happen all the way through, and that's fine. I don't think it's for me. I tried to do it a bit once, but I didn't feel happy with it, so I just reverted to my old type. And one of the good things for me is that as I'm writing the book, like a reader, I don't know what happens. So it's all until I get to about 3/4 of the way through. I have to work out who does it, but it's like writing is like reading a book in a way.
No, and that's what a lot of people say who do it, and Donna's agreeing with me, because I think she's probably interviewed sort of a lot of people the same way, and it's why I didn't look shocked. A lot of the people I've interviewed who've written really complicated books are other people who go,
Yeah.
well,
Yeah.
just go and see what happens. But
yes, I think on this book I didn't know. Yes, I didn't know really. I set going various different plot lines, which I won't go in. I've touched upon already. I set them all running, and yes, I was probably in the. If you take the first draft was 200,000 words, I was probably about 170,000 words in, and I still didn't know who'd done any of anything, and I had to work it all.
You wove them together brilliantly, though. I think that's what sold the book to me. Like, I started off and I was like, I don't know how I feel. Like, we discussed when we did the promo, it's not my genre of book that I would read. So I started off and I was a bit hesitant, and then as I got drawn in and the stories were weaving together, you captured my interest, and I was sort of like it. Someone said it's a hefty book, but it's so easy to read. I read it so quickly because you're so taken by all the stories, and it goes at such a pace that you are kind of moving along.
I was very pleased this week, and I got a nice review in the Times, and I'm a Times pick of the week. But he said various things which were all very complimentary. But the one thing I liked best was he said how well written the books are, because I think any writer wants to know they're writing well, and obviously want to get the plots right and everything else. But it is one thing I know that is improving. It is a thing you can sense that you're getting more adept at it as you go from book to book, and your self-editing becomes quicker and more effective. You know not to be repetitive. And but also hopefully you know how to get the right characters that grip you without spending too much time, because I don't spend an awful lot of time in descriptive writing. I try and just get pinpoints or bullet points of people so that they hopefully leap off the page.
They do work. That's, I think, it's another thing I picked up in my review as a strength. I think the characters feel really deep and you are really involved with them, even sort of the people who are maybe not as likable, are in there to be the bad guys. It's all sort of drawn into their story. Is that
well? Sorry, I love writing all my characters. That's good.
It's absolutely hammering it down behind me. It's really loud.
Is it really? Okay, no, I don't think it's cloudy outside, but not raining.
It might travel down to you soon.
Well, it was nice yesterday. But one of the things that I probably should say is that when I started out writing these books, which was when I started writing the first one, was about 2005, 2006. The internet didn't really exist in the way it does now. So I used to go to Kew Public Records office to go through all the old newspapers. And now, of course, the world is completely different. I mean, along the way, I've built up quite a library of wartime books, both history books, diaries, biographies, even novels which are set in the period, like Graham Greene or something, which are very helpful. But on the internet, you can get everything. I mean, I tried to write accurately, and not for people to be able to pick me up on things. But you can do things like, if you want to know whether it's raining on a Saturday morning in June 1942 in St James's Park, you can actually find that out. And you can find out, if you're talking about the Blitz, which planes were up in the air, from which airfields. In this current book, as you know, there's a bomber squadron, American bomber squadron. I could work out exactly where that was and how they would get into London on a train. It's amazing how much easier it is in a way. But I have only been picked up on two things. One is in my first book, or picked up successfully, I would say. One is in my first book. I mentioned there's someone who works for the Ministry of Defence, and I put that down. And there was no Ministry of Defence; it was the War Office. And if anyone who buys my books, they'll still see the mistake in there, because somehow or other, because I moved on from publisher to publisher, the new publishers can't adjust. They haven't got the original whatever, so they can't adjust it. So that mistake sits there forever. And there was one other one which I think I'm right on, but it's never been definitive, which is in my second book. which was Stalin's goal, is now called Under the Shadows of the Blitz. Merlin is with a friend on the beach in Brighton, looking at a Battle of Britain fight going on above him. And someone wrote to him to say he couldn't have gone on Brighton Beach because it was mined. And this was, I can't remember the exact time, it was something like the end of September in 1940. And I found evidence that, in fact, it had been closed on October the 1st. So I just got it in time. But otherwise, no one's picked me up yet.
That's good.
Historical accuracy, I think it's important. Historical accuracy. You need to feel, if you're going to build that world and recreate that world, you want people, I think readers want to know that it's genuine.
It is, and we've still got so much kind of history of it, haven't we, in like bases and sort of things throughout the UK that we've used more and built from the war.
By the way, Kaz, I'm just seeing someone is saying, Facebook user, 200,000 words, that's a hefty book. What I didn't point out is the original draft was 200,000 words, but I cut it down to 110. So yes, 200,000 is too long for crime fiction. Somewhere around 100, 110 is where I normally end up.
So Sam has made a good point as well. She said the other thing that comes from the circumstances of war is a sense of togetherness and support. Strong bonds are formed that must be useful to consider when writing.
Yes, obviously, yeah. There is a lot of camaraderie in my books. Obviously, the police have their own relationships, and there are obviously there are a lot of bad characters, but there are a lot of good characters too. And someone asked me the other day, one of those Q&A things, what period would you like to go back and look at and be in history? And I said the Blitz. I'd have to have a look at the Blitz as long as I was in a safe spot. So I would just love to experience that and the camaraderie that existed in the undergrounds and so on in London. Would have been interesting to experience that. I also have to say that I said they gave me two options, and I chose ancient Rome as well because I did classics for my A level, and I've always been very keen on ancient Rome.
I'm going to ask you some of our group favourite questions now.
Okay.
But before I get to those, actually, I'm going to ask you my current favourite question, which is what have been your favourite reads of the year so far?
Yes, I read a book. It's an old book, well, oldish, like 20 or 30 years old, by someone called Lionel Davidson, who it's called the Kalimsky Heights. It's a sort of combination crime thriller, very complicated, but I was attracted to it because I saw a very famous author whose name is now going to escape me say this is the greatest thriller ever written. Sorry, to show my who wrote the Philip the stories about Oxford in the future. Help me. No. Okay. Anyway, someone very famous said it was very good. I'm also quite keen on. There's an Icelandic author called Ragnar Jonasson, who writes detective books set in Iceland. There are a lot of Icelandic writers these days, but all of his books are about 150 pages long, and they're very easy to digest. I like that. And I'm currently reading House of Fire, City of Fire, by Don Winslow. I love Don Winslow. He's great. Do you know him?
I have heard of him. I have not read him.
Right. He's very good. This is a mafia thing. You may not like mafia things. Some people do, some people don't. But he also wrote a series about Mexican cartels, and it's incredibly vivid.
I'm a fan of Godfather. I don't know how much mafia things I would like.
Yeah, the Godfather. Anyway, my all-time favorite writer is in the detective genre is Georges Simenon, as in Maigret. I love him. And there's about 150 books out there. I've only read about 80, so I've still got some to go.
Excellent. So, group favourite questions now. Your most memorable moments as an author so far?
To be honest, it's probably this week being picked as a Times Pick of the Week, because that doesn't happen to many people. And also, my third book was nominated for CWA Dagger. I didn't win it, but I was nominated, which is again very encouraging. And otherwise, it's always a great day when you finish the book and you submit it. Those are always great days, and publication days are good too.
How do you celebrate publication days?
You know, to be perfectly honest, that was yesterday, and I had a relatively quiet day. But I when I finished and submitted the book is when I tend to have go out for a nice dinner or a glass of wine, something like that.
Fair enough. And have you ever acted out a scene as you've written it?
Well, I do. I mean, when I do my research, I do physically go to places, so to try and make sure what's happening there is correct. So again, without not saying too much, there are some scenes which set by the river in Chelsea where certain things go on in the book. So I go down there and I try and work out the logistics of what's going on. But no, I've never physically murdered someone to see what it feels like for book purposes.
Or pretended to. We've had authors that have sat and held a knife to their throat to see what.
Oh, really? Okay, no, I've not done that.
Or acted out fights, and
yeah,
it's a good question.
Well, no, I did that particular scene, which you will remember. I did step through it. I didn't physically. I worked out where the people would be and so on.
Yeah, I feel like that's a scene that you would need to do that with.
Yeah.
And my favorite question, or one of my other favorite questions, is: would you make a graphic novel of one of your books?
You mean would I actually draw it?
No. Normally, when you make a graphic novel, you work with an artist.
I've never been asked that question. That's quite a good idea. I think I can imagine any of these stories as quite with a good artist. Yes. If someone was interested in doing it with me, I would do it.
I'm basically a massive nerd. It's why I ask it.
Sorry, say that again, Kaz.
I said I'm basically a massive nerd. It's why I ask the question. I like comics.
Okay. Well, I like comics. I was lucky enough when after my father died, when I was living with my mother and my grandparents, they owned a small newsagent, and I had first dibs at all the Superman comics and all that stuff. It was great. On a Sunday, I remember when the shop was closed, I remember sitting there just going through all the various comics of the time. There were, Superman. There were a whole bunch of comics which were based on classic novels, like Treasure Island, things like that, which I guess you'd call graphic novels now.
And are your books available on audio?
Yes, they are. Yes, all of them. I have a very good narrator called Matt Addis, who is Welsh, actually, like me. And he, when he started out, he was only doing a few books. Now he reads books for about 50 or 60 authors. So he's building a very good name there, and he does a fantastic job on my audio. And I did notice yesterday that on the first day of existence, the audio version had gone into the top 20 of World War II audios on Audible. I'm not quite sure how many you have to sell to get into the top 20 of World War II audios, but it looked good.
Would you ever write like a standalone book?
Yes, I think I would. I think I would like to try other things, and yes, I would. The answer is yes. I don't have an idea, but at some point you need a break. Obviously, to a certain extent, this is what I write. It's becoming more popular and better known, and obviously the publisher just wants more and more and more. So there's that. But yes, I think at some point in the next 2 or 3 years, I'd like to have a go at a standalone novel.
Would you ever be tempted to write kind of spin-off novels about some of your characters? So I feel like your woman detective would be really good, or there's a lady who is a translator. I'm not giving away anything. There's a lady who's a translator for the Portuguese.
Yeah.
And I would wholeheartedly read a story just about those two, or just one of them. If that
That's good to know. That's good to know. I think off the top of my head, writing about Robinson, who's the constable, I could think quite a few different ways you could take her. I mean, there is an author I know who I've been on panels with called Vasim Khan, who writes books about like a detective in India at the time of just after the war, when there were, of course, it was an unknown thing almost, and it was a pretty unknown thing for a woman for there to be a woman in CID in the war. So yes is the answer. I could do that. Also, of course, you got the American Friend. You know, I could do something with Goldberg. I could do something with him too when he goes back to America.
He'd be another interesting one to read out, I think.
Yeah.
Because you don't.
Thanks for the idea. Thanks for the idea, Kaz. That's good.
Yeah. Well, you don't see much of Goldberg in the book that I've read. I mean, I presume you do in other ones.
He's in which one is he in? He's in Merlin at War, I think, which is now the French Spy. So to remember this now, it's going to be complicated.
It would be quite nice to know more about him.
Yeah. Well, there is more of him in that one. He's more integrally involved with the investigation than he is in this one. I mean, this one he's there, but he's not so much involved in the investigation. He's of help. Yeah.
And he gets to see Stalin.
Yeah, he gets to see Stalin. Could write a spin-off about Stalin, of course. You know, Stalin as a detective. That would be a good one.
Sam wants to know if there were movies made of your books. Would you want them to be true to your version, or would you be interested to see somebody else's vision of your work?
That's a good question. I think you start out probably, you sit down and you want it to be true to my version. But I think you have to accept that a movie is a different work of art or a TV series than what you've written. And if they develop it in a way that's sensible and if it's dropping one character, putting another character in it, and it all makes sense, I wouldn't be completely put out. No, I think you have to be realistic.
I think it's interesting, isn't it? Because some people really want a lot of control over the adaptations of their things, and then others are quite happy to just let someone take it and do
it. I have had TV film interest, but nothing has materialized. I did early on. I had the BBC interested, but the people who I was talking to got sacked or moved or something, and it went away. But obviously, one hopes it might come back. I think that my books would be quite good filmically. I think they're written, with short, sharp scenes in a way I think that would lend itself to adaptation. Do you agree? Do you agree?
I do. And I was having this conversation about TV adaptations with Ben Aranovich the other day, and he said he deliberately wrote some of the scenes in his books to make them really expensive and really hard to film.
Oh, really? Okay. Well, okay. He must be not as easygoing as me then.
I think he is. He's written for TV, so I think he said when he wrote his own thing, he kind of deliberately went the opposite way.
Yeah.
Because he wasn't writing for it to be filmed, so he was like, I can put in everything in the kitchen sink into my book. But now he knows that if there's like TV interest, he's kind of made it so it's really hard to film.
Yeah.
Which is, I think, quite interesting because, I wonder if that plays in your mind as you're writing. Do you sort of think, as you're writing it, this could be a TV thing?
The way when I started, not having written for like 30 years while I had a career, but starting again, I just naturally started to write this way to push the story forward. So it's not something I've consciously done, but I do realize now, as people say to me, well, that it does lend itself to film adaptation.
It really does. We've got a minute left. So finish our chat off by showing off your books, remind us about a little bit about them, tell people how they can get signed copies if that's a possible thing.
Sure. Well, I've only got this one, which is the latest, because obviously the new covers I haven't got them in yet. But if people want to look at the new covers, I am on Twitter, which is at Mark Ellis 15, and I tweeted a lot about the new covers today. But this is the one we've been talking about. It was published yesterday. It's available in print, ebook, audio in this country and in Europe. Actually, the print version is being published in America in January, so I'll have another sort of PR promotional thing in America in January. It's published by Headline accent, which is part of Hachette. I commend it to you. Is there anything else I should say? Social media. I'm on Twitter. I'm on Facebook. I've got 2 pages on Facebook. One is my personal one, Mark Ellis, and I've also got an author one, Mark Ellis Author. I've got a website which is called markellisauthor.com. I am on Instagram. I think it's Markel1 or something like that. To be honest, I don't use Instagram as much as I should. I'm on LinkedIn, so I'm on everything. But the ones I use most are Facebook and Twitter. In terms of getting signed copies, if anyone's interested, if they'd like to send me a message on my website or on Facebook, if you can't send it to a message, you can friend me and I'll friend you back, and I can see if I can get signed copies for you.
Perfect. And then all that's left to say is thanks so much for joining us.
Thank you. As I say, it's been a pleasure and an honor. And thank you very much, Kaz, and thank you much, everyone, for listening in. It's great.